Hey everyone, Sarah here, back with another video. So today again, we are doing the next video in the story structure series. So in this video, we are going to be talking about a structure that has started to pick up in popularity in the Western world, but is often misunderstood, and that is Kishotenketsu. So what we're going to do today is we are going to cover each of the sort of acts or parts of the structure. And then there are a couple of different things I'd like to discuss, mainly where this structure originates and why it's actually a bit of a controversial structure when it comes to long form narrative, and also why it is not a structure without conflict, because I know some of you are interested in this structure because a lot of people talk about it being a structure that has no conflict, but we'll discuss why that's not actually true. And then, as always, at the end, we'll discuss what sort of stories this structure is suited for. Okay, so Kishotenketsu. This name of the structure literally just is a list of the 4 parts or the 4 acts of this structure. So let's go over them quickly. First, we have ki, which is just the opening or the beginning of the story. The character for ki literally means to stand up or to start. Next we have sho, which this character itself actually means to receive or to listen to, but in this context it just means the continuation or the development. So this is basically the development and continuation of the story. So this would be the sort of main part of a narrative. Next we have ten. Now this character literally means to fall or twist. So this is actually a twist in the story. So where you have your opening ki, and then the continuation of the narrative, sho, you come to basically what would be a plot point or a pinch point, whatever you want to call it. From a Western standpoint, is a twist in the story, and we'll come back to this when we discuss what sort of stories this suits. But this is sort of where the story changes in direction. It takes a new turn and sort of it reveals the conflict and the new path towards the climax, which is the last part, ketsu. Now this ketsu, it just means conclusion or closing off. It just basically means the end of the story. So it would be the climax and the closing out. Usually this is also with another twist. So even though it's not explicitly stated in the Kishotenketsu, it's often understood that you have 2 twists in this structure. You have your first twist with the 10, the third one, and then you have a final sort of twist that brings the story down and lands it at the conclusion. And that's it. Now this structure is very, very bare bones, and there is a reason for that, which we will discuss in a moment. So first, let's discuss where this structure originates. So even though the name Kishotenketsu is actually Japanese, the origin of this structure itself is in China. So in China, it's gotten almost the same name. It's actually called He. And so originally, this isn't actually a structure for long form narrative. This is a particular structure for classical Chinese poetry. Now, the actual point of origin for this phrase and for the idea of this structure isn't really known. A lot of people attribute it to the ancient poet Li Bai, but he actually predates the first recorded instances of the mentioning of this structure. So it's believed that it's invented after the Tang Dynasty. As far as Kishotenketsu, as in a Japanese version of this structure in reference to Chinese poetry, it's existed since about the middle of the 16th century. So there are records of it being used to describe and talk about Chinese poetry and that structure of classical poetry. However, it doesn't appear to have been used to refer to a narrative structure for longer works, for anything other than classical Chinese poetry, until the mid-20th century, or the early mid-20th century. For example, in the 1930s in Japan, there was an essayist and poet called Torahiko Terada, and he spoke of it being natural to use this structure in narrative and for novels. But it doesn't really appear to have entered the common vernacular as a reference to narrative or novel story structures until at least the 1940s. There was also a well-known sort of children's writer around the same time called Takahiro Imai, and he basically referred to this structure as being the basis that all children should learn narrative structure from. And he described it as basically being beginning, continuation, the substitution or the twist, and then the conclusion. But that's it for what the structure originally was and sort of where it came about, and this word of Kishotenketsu started to be actually used to refer to narrative structures. But the thing is, in the 20th century and even now, it's still controversial actually about whether it should be used as a basis for long-form narrative. There have actually been a lot of academics throughout the 20th century and stuff, and still in Japan, who basically just say that this is solely a structure for classical Chinese poetry, for four-line verse Chinese poetry, and that it's nothing more than that, and it should not be used for narrative structure or for essays or for any other form of writing. And quite often in the West, you find that people talk about this Kishotenketsu, this sort of 4-act structure, as being the Japanese equivalent to a 3-act structure, but that's not the case because Japan also has its own traditional version of the 3-act structure, and that is called Johakyu. Now this structure, again, it doesn't originate in long-form narrative fiction. It has its origins in classical Japanese music and theatre, for example, no plays, traditional Japanese folk sort of music, as not like folk music, but as in music that was played for ceremonies and performances. So this is the equivalent, the traditional Japanese equivalent of a 3-act structure, where it refers to the pace of the music and the story of these plays, where jo means the opening or the setup, ha actually means destruction, and it means speeding up. It means things, the pace picks up. And then kyu actually means sudden, and it means, again, it speeds up. So this is the traditional version of the 3-act structure, which is quite often actually used to refer to something closer to the Western version of a 3-act structure these days. But it has its origins in traditional Japanese music and theatre. So if you guys are interested in actually learning a bit more about that, I can do a video for you as well. So let me know in the comments if you're interested. But yes, that is sort of the history of Kishotenketsu. Next, let's discuss about why this isn't actually a structure without conflict. So I know recently when people talk about story structures, and a lot of people like to say, but what if my story doesn't have conflict? You know, what if there's nothing conflict happening, there's no problems, all of that sort of thing. And people will bring out this Kishotenketsu and they'll say, oh, this is a structure that supports stories without conflict. You know, and they will almost always point to that sort of Japanese subgenre or like genre of slice of life stories. But there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what slice of life stories are, saying that they don't have conflict. There is always conflict. There's just low stakes conflict or hidden conflict. So Kishotenketsu isn't a structure without conflict, even though in the definition of the structure in each part, because it's so bare bones, it doesn't mention anything about conflict. It just mentions having a narrative story beginning, basically a middle, a continuation, a twist, and a conclusion to that twist. That doesn't mean that there's not conflict. The conflict is actually hidden. So the big difference here is that while in a Western structure like the 3-act structure or the hero's journey, right at the start of the story, you are given the conflict. You are shown this is the conflict of the story, or this is the character's inner turmoil, and this is what the story is going to be trying to fix. It's revealed sort of at the end of the first act what the main center of conflict and problems in this story is going to be. However, in Kishotenketsu, that is hidden. It's not that it's not there. It's hidden until you get to the ten, or the twist of the story, the third act twist, where it is revealed what the conflict is. So the best example of this is through 4-panel comics. So in Japan, they have these things called yonkoma manga, which are just comics with 4 panels. That's it. And they are based on using Kishotenketsu, 1 act for each panel. And I'll throw up an example on the screen now. Okay, so here it is, and I have put little translations for the speech bubbles because it's in Japanese. So you see, it is just 4 panels in a row, and we have the Kishotenketsu. So the opening of the story, where this little character and he's saying, "This is the human realm? I came from the fluffy realm." And this guy's like, "Oh my god, you're so cute, what's that?" So there we have our setup. This little creature has come to the human world. And then in the continuation of the story, all we do is build on that opening. And he says to this lady, "What's your blood type?" She goes, "My blood type? I'm B, actually." So, nothing particularly conflict here. We've just got a continuation of the story. It has set up a little bit of a question. Why is this thing asking that? And then we go down to the twist. "Don't you have any friends that are AB? What about AB negative? Don't you know anyone?" This little, oh my god, suddenly this little thing is really angry. That's a twist in the story that you don't expect that, do you? What does this mean? And then we have our conclusion. This lady's going, "The fluffy world must have someone losing a lot of blood." I know, it's ridiculous, it's a bit absurd, but this is a very good example of how conflict is hidden in a story until you get to the twist. So even though in the beginning, in the opening, and then the continuation, in those first 2 acts of this story, we aren't shown any conflicts, as soon as we get to the twist down here, we know for a fact that there is a conflict happening, even if we weren't partial to it in those first 2 acts. And then obviously we have our final conclusion, which again throws in a little bit of a twist ending, just a bit of fun in the end. So you'll see from an example like that, which is a very typical sort of Kishotenketsu structure use, that there is conflict. It is just revealed very late in the story, and it's sort of used to sort of change your opinion or what you might have thought about the beginning and continuation of the story in retrospect. So, and you'll find in poetry that uses this structure, so in the traditional classical poetry, both in Chinese and Japanese, that it's used as a sort of deepening of the previous lines. So I'll put up an example of a Japanese poem that uses this structure, a very famous one. I'll put that up on the screen now. Okay, so here's an example. I'll read it out for you. 大阪本町糸屋の娘。姉は16、妹は14。諸国大名は弓矢で殺す。糸屋の娘は目で殺す。So here's the translation. Daughters of Itoya in the Honmachi of Osaka. The eldest daughter is 16 and the younger is 14. Daimyo killed the enemy with bows and arrows, but the daughters of Itoya kill with their eyes. So you see, this is a little bit harder to understand because obviously it's poetry, and this was written in the, I think, Meiji period, the Edo period, actually. But anyway, so you see we have the opening line where we have our setting and our characters, and then we have the continuation, which is just more information or more building on the previous line. We can have more information about those characters, the daughters. But then we have our twist, where suddenly we're taken somewhere totally different. We're taken and told about, daimyo, lords, saying that they kill people with bows and arrows. That's a totally different place to where the story originally was. It's a twist or some sort of exchange into something else. And then we have our conclusion, which twists again to tie that twist to the previous story that we've been watching or listening to. The daughters of Itoya kill with their eyes. So as you can see from this example again, we have our opening, our continuation or our build-up without any conflict there. And then we have a twist in the story that takes us somewhere totally different, but then reveals some sort of conflict. And then we have our conclusion, which brings that twist and ties it together with all the previous parts of the story. So as I said, this is not a structure without conflict. Far from it. It's just a very different way of using conflict. It keeps it hidden throughout the story until it is revealed through that twist for massive impact. And then again, we're given another little twist with the conflict in the conclusion. Okay, so lastly, as always, let's talk about what sort of stories are suited for this structure. Now, this is a difficult one because, as I've already discussed, this is not a structure built for long-form narrative. It is a poetry structure for classical Chinese poetry and Japanese poetry. So I'm going to be a bit controversial here and say that it is not good to use this for long-form narrative. I mean, you can, but it's just too bare bones. It doesn't have a lot of all of the other parts of a story that something like a novel would need. You can mix this together, for example, with another structure to strengthen it up, and it would work perfectly well for a novel. It'd be a very interesting idea to try and mix this in with the Western version of a 3-act structure, where the conflict is sort of pushed later on into the story, sort of hidden throughout that main first 2 acts or so, or the first 1.5 acts. But yeah, on its own, this is not going to work for a novel or for a long-form narrative, in my opinion. However, I think this is actually a very good structure to use for short stories. So we've just gone over the poetry examples and also the 4-panel comic examples. And I think that 4-panel comic example gives the best idea of how this structure actually really works with short form narratives. So short stories obviously have their own sort of structure. You'll notice if you read lots of short stories that they never actually conclude quite like a novel would, They have their own way of telling a story, which is, in my opinion, very similar to this Kishotenketsu way of telling a story. So I think if you want to try this structure, try writing short stories, try using this format for shorter fiction. As for genre, I think usually this structure, as I've said, it's used in basically all forms of 4-panel comics. And if you read 4-panel comics, you'll find that most of them are sort of comedy or comedy adjacent. They're all almost always bordering on the absurd or the surreal, and that's because of this heavy emphasis on the twist right before the ending. So you'll find that having that sort of twist where they say take it somewhere totally different works really well with comedy. But I think it also works really well with a story that has a lot of mystery in it, or for example horror stories. Horror stories love to have twists. They also love to have lots of mystery and sort of hidden parts of story. So things that really benefit from having a twist taken to somewhere different, stories that like to be subverted in different ways, mysteries, horrors, comedies, that sort of thing. Okay, so that's it pretty much for Kishotenketsu or Chichenjuanhe, whichever name you'd like to use. I hope that that's sort of bit more of an in-depth look at where this structure came from helps people to understand it a bit more. But yeah, I hope that what you take away from this is basically that it's a very bare bones structure. It's not really for long form narratives, and that it does indeed have conflict, even if you can't quite see it. So that's it for this video. If you have any thoughts or opinions or comments, anything you'd like me to talk about in a different video, anything like that, just leave some comments below. I always read them. But I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. So until then, keep those fingers on the keyboard, and I'll see you then. Bye.